This afternoon's discussion is about oneness, future of interspirituality. Well, perhaps you've never heard of interspirituality. It's a new development in the interreligious dialogue scene. And it's worth remembering that at this point in the evolutionary history of the human species, something has happened that has never happened before, and that is the possibility of dialogue between living spiritual practitioners who are advanced both in experience and in the skills of transmission of the experience. I guess every religion or reforming moment comes from a movement of the Holy Spirit in a particular religious milieu, or without one, with a view of initiating one. And so someone or some group of people have an enormous infusion of the divine presence, or the magisterium tremendum and fascinans that we spoke of, descends with an enormous empowerment on some person, as in the case of the Buddha, who incidentally had tried every means of achieving enlightenment through action by a very permissive lifestyle in the palace where he was brought up. And then when he saw that there's no future to that, he encountered a few corpses. That's always a help. He then tried to enter into the forest and take on himself, in his generosity, every conceivable ascetical practice. And as far as he could see, nothing happened. So with a certain level of frustration, he sat down under the Bodhi tree, as you know, and did nothing. And it was at that moment that he received one of the greatest enlightenment experience that humanity has ever had. So it isn't effort that reaches enlightenment as such. It's true there are all kinds of efforts, but if we put our confidence in our own efforts, we're on the wrong road. The real purpose of effort is to find out that it doesn't work. And that's exactly what Buddha's experience was. And that disposed him to turn himself over completely to God. And then his enlightenment, in which he perceived that dukkha, that is all needless suffering, comes out of misguided effort of trying to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. An affliction that occurs in every religion and in every ascetical milieu when you lose sight of the purity of the original experience of the founders, in which they perceive this enormous enlightenment as a total gratuity. And so that's one of the basic elements of oneness, in the sense of the substantial understanding of the meaning and purpose of life. It isn't for our glorification, in case you don't know. It's not for our satisfaction. It's not for our perfection or our private enlightenment. It's to manifest the infinite goodness, which is humility at the same time. So humility and love are basically the same thing, or two sides of the same thing. And so to imitate this kind of oneness is a very radical and comprehensive pursuit of beauty, truth, and goodness at any cost. And there is a cost, and the cost is the death of the separate self sense, the willingness to let go of who we are. And the great motive for that is that God himself, as Paul says in the letter to the Philippians, that God, the Word of God, that is the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, the person who is everything that the Father is, the total enjoyer of the whole of the treasures of the divine essence, didn't think being God was something to cling to. In other words, to hell with it, to put it very bluntly, or to emphasize the total non-possessiveness of reality, which has everything, doesn't need anything, and only wants to give it away. So that all of the aggravation that the false self stirs up by trying to accomplish something on our own steam, or to make efforts that are going to lead to a result that we want, this is not it, to say the least. What is it is this boundless confidence that expects to receive everything that you could possibly desire without effort, except the effort of receiving, or in our centering prayer language, of consenting. Now, is consenting work? Yes. It's the hardest work there is. So that there may be a juxtaposition of words here. What is not the right effort is effort as we understand it that will produce a result. The genuine effort is the effort that is ready to die in the service of the goal without attributing any of the result to oneself. Now, this is what we mean by grace. It means free gift. And so to be willing to receive God just as God is the hardest thing there is for a human being. Why? Because of pride. We don't want to receive everything. We want to do it ourselves, or get some credit out of it, or get some reward or some dividend, or whatever your category of rewards you're in. Baloney. That's not it. The oneness that we're looking for is the oneness of utter self-emptying, even to the point of letting go of our self-identity. No danger of your being wiped out or annihilated. God doesn't regret whatever he creates, especially human beings. So in fidelity to himself, our uniqueness is always going to remain. But it's not a uniqueness that is manifesting anything we think we are, but rather is manifesting through commitment or union with the divine will, whatever God's plan is for us and for humanity. So there are many onenesses. And it's a delicate term. We're dealing here with very refined language that really you shouldn't talk about if you had any sense. Because you can't possibly make the distinctions that deserve to be made. Or if you succeed, you can't communicate them to somebody else in human language. The rational level of consciousness has limitations. It's a great achievement of evolution, but it's only a start on the possibilities of future levels of unity and union with God. So the first problem with saying oneness is that it isn't oneness only. It's infinite oneness and infinite diversity at the same time. So what makes God impossible to comprehend is that he's absolute unity, and as far as you can conceive of that, and a concept that took generations for the monotheistic religions to come into being. That was the triumph of human religious history. Oneness is very strongly affirmed, as you know, in the Abrahamic traditions. Islam is very strong on this, and actually some historians believe that Mohammed's inspiration was a reaction to what he conceived as the complexities of the Trinitarian relationships, where there were three persons possessing one divine essence, or relating would be a better word, since in the Trinity there isn't any possessiveness at all, or at least if you use that word it would be misleading. But God, because of the Trinitarian insight into the Trinity, is not only one, but is three relationships to one essence. And the only thing that distinguishes them is the way they relate to the one divine essence. One to give it, one to receive it, the other to express their perfect unity and total self-gift to each other so that they live in each other, not in themselves. So there's no self in God. There is no possessiveness in God. Everything is pure love, that is, giving itself away without any consideration of return or reward. It's just sheer gratuity, goodness, goodness, goodness. So being is relational of its very nature. Only this God, who is one and three, is beyond being, because he's the source of being. So there's no way for us to conceive of something that is beyond, you might say, of anything that we can understand, at least metaphysically. So God is infinitely one and infinitely diverse at the same time. This is why solitude or aloneness is an aspect of the spiritual journey or of the completion of the enlightened process. It's not an end in itself, nor is silence, as much as we extol it. And you can't exaggerate it. But that's not quite it, because God is not only in eternal rest, but in eternal movement. In fact, it would be a mistake, I think, to think of God as a noun. God is not a thing or an object. He's everything. That is, he's a subjectivity that penetrates every other thing in existence. And so it's better to think of God as a happening. Only he's not just a happening, but he's every happening at once, because he's totally present to all diversity. So these ideas, although they stumble and mumble different words or concepts, at least suggest that our idea of God needs to be expanded and expanded and expanded. You cannot think of God in any concrete way, because God is. He is isness itself. And so he's happening all the time. And this diversity is coterminous with his oneness, unity and diversity, unity in diversity, diversity in unity. just to juggle a few words around. And this is a model for human society. We're a little too primitive yet to get it. But it's there in the concepts that have been revealed, and which science is now reinforcing with its discoveries. Everything is interdependent. Everything is related to everything else. And this is proven in quantum mechanics and in the particle theory. And just to make matters even more worse confounded for the poor scientists, you can't make an observation without your own subjective character or talents having something to do with the result. So there is no objective evidence, at least not as a result from human observation. The principle of uncertainty, recently discovered in quantum mechanics, suggests that you can only predict possibilities in the subatomic world. Now, fortunately, they always work out. Otherwise, we'd have quite a lot of chaos around this room. But the subatomic world is totally chaotic, and yet out of at each moment, order is being brought together, but it's not certain. It's very much in flux, and it's always changing. So the old metaphysical concepts of God as almighty and omniscient and all-powerful, these are not quite able to communicate the dynamic quality. So when we say that God is changeless, perhaps we mean that God is always changing, and that's the thing that doesn't change. So God is always in movement and at rest at the same time. So in the contemplative journey, which is this participation in ever greater degrees in the divine life, and becoming, so to speak, God by dispositions and attitudes and participations, means that we should begin to be able to live in a situation of immense activity and perfect rest at the same time. So to be God-like is to be able to express our contemplative dispositions in the midst of any activity or any situation, because this is what God does, and if you're becoming like God. So silence then is a relative benefit that is especially necessary for us in the beginning, because we're locked into the habits and practices of the false self with its concepts and convictions that are cockeyed. And so to get over those, to stop thinking, is perhaps the shortest and most direct cut, at least as a regular discipline that we do every day. So the centering prayer discipline is undermining the false self insofar as it has settled into certain attitudes that involve prepackaged values and predetermined attitudes that are not true, that are illusions. So, oneness then in God is also multiplicity of an infinite character, and perhaps it would be better to say that God, or to talk about God as unity and multiplicity of an infinite character, with an infinite diversity between the persons and relationships, and an infinite unity. Well, if God can live in perfect peace and unity with infinite diversity, maybe there's some hope for the human family, who is not infinite in either direction. But the model that we need is this unity in diversity. So oneness needs to be preached today more than almost anything else, it seems to me, because it hasn't been grasped by humanity, although it has been preached by every serious religion. One in our source, one in our destiny, one in our nature, one as a part of creation. All kinds of onenesses, but there are a few that you might not think of right away, and which are even more powerful or more certain. And these are just suggestions, but one oneness that is especially powerful and easy to access is oneness in human misery. That is, oneness in the experience of powerlessness, oneness in the experience of human weakness, oneness in the experience of the emotional turmoil of afflictive emotions when our personal self-centered desires are frustrated, as they inevitably will be as we enter into the full participation in adult life. Perhaps just one example that might be helpful at this point. And to make it concrete, let me share this experience of mine as a young man who was preparing to enter the monastery. This had not always been my life's goal or project. But in God's mercy, I knew someone 20 years older than myself who cared for my sister and my older brother as a nurse when she first came from Iceland as a young girl of 18 and had no job, and so she took on this job of supervising my older brother, who was rather difficult to handle. And when he was told that he now had a nurse who was going to take care of him full time, he said, "If she tries to tell me to do anything, I'll kick her right in the shins." And she said, "I'll kick you right back." And from then on, they became good friends. But she also became good friends with me. And this was a person, very rare in this world, who emphasized above every other attitude trying to understand other people, why they do things the way they do, and without judging them. And she tried so hard to understand everybody, or in my case, me, that even if she didn't understand what I was doing, which was probably true, she didn't know what monks were. She wasn't even a Catholic at the time. It was as good as if she understood you. In other words, she really loved you. But anyway, she married a guy from Iceland, and he was an alcoholic, and he never quite got over it, and he finally got sick and died. And at some point, she became a Catholic, actually, from listening to me and reading the books that I was reading. And we were extremely close because I shared with her, some of her sorrows and concerns as her husband disintegrated. And all of these difficulties sort of wove us close together, and especially as my family and my parents were vigorously against my going into a monastery, I found in her, even though she didn't know what the world I was doing, the kind of understanding that was enormously supportive. Well, it came time to leave for this monastery. And I said the necessary goodbyes at home, which was very difficult. it was really like dying, because in those days you might never see the people again, your family. You couldn't go home even if there was a sickness or death in the family. So it was a very strict life, right out of the Desert Fathers, you might say. And the silence was very great. You couldn't write home except 2 or 3 times a year, and then maybe one letter. So it was a vigorous leaving of the world in that classical sense of monastic life in its origins in the Egyptian deserts of the 4th century. So it came time to say goodbye to her. So I forget where we met the last time. But it was poignant because I knew that I meant more to her than anyone else in this world, and I was leaving, and she would never see me again as far as we knew. But I had to go because I felt that was God's will for me, and I was really ready to go through fire and water to get there. Well, anyway, to get back to my dear friend Selma, we said a very poignant goodbye, and I figured that's the end of it. And I steeled myself, and I went to the next day to the train station, the Grand Central Station. And when I went in the station, there she was, waiting for one more goodbye. It was excruciating. To say goodbye once was about all I could handle. And so when I saw her again, I said, "Oh no, I can't." That was my immediate feeling reaction. Talk about gut feelings. It was shattering. And yet I couldn't say to her, "You shouldn't have come," because she had made great sacrifices, and God only knows what she was going through in her mind. But this is the mystery of divine love when it expresses itself in very fragile and weak humans. It expresses itself in incredible sense of weakness and powerlessness and impossibility of changing it. It's sheer pain, but it is so good and beautiful, and the expression of a relationship that was so tender and meaningful over many years, that it was an experience of incredible oneness. We were completely together in what was for us absolute sorrow. Gone, worse than death, you might say. I didn't say anything more except a few goodbyes because I didn't know that I could handle anything more. And so we departed, and that second time, and that experience, as I have reflected on it over the years, of course I went on to all the labors of the monastery and so on. But my further experience has convinced me that God allows things to happen in your life, that as a result of your nature, or even what is most loving and beautiful and generous about you, and it brings you into a place of utmost torment, where you're invited to be one with someone else in their grief and sorrow. So for me, that is a great insight into what the incarnation really means. It means, to me, that God so loved us as to give us the opportunity of what it feels like not to be God, or to lose that person of the Blessed Trinity, at least temporarily, out of one's life. Because remember that Jesus, in becoming human, became sin, which is the opposite of God. And so it was as if he was confronted with the utmost example of unrequited love, to love somebody beyond measure, and to have that person reject you. Now, in the case of Christ, this was temporary and part of the will of God in order to manifest what love is, which is beyond love. In other words, there's a place where one lets go not only of the rewards of love or the interaction of love or the support that love is, but is willing to let go of love itself for a greater good or for the sake of the common good of humanity. So in the case of Christ and his attitude, an attitude that also appears in the other traditions, but in different language and a different, perhaps, level of understanding. But in Buddhism, the bodhisattva attitude is the willingness to let everybody else enter into the enlightened state when you are already entitled to it. But instead of taking advantage of it or taking what you have been given, you let go of one's own very being, so to speak, or its purpose, in order to unite oneself with what is weakest and poorest in others, and to bear a kind of suffering that is not due to the false self, but is due to the intensity of love when it has to lay itself down for a greater good. It's hard, of course, to explain exactly that. So, but anyway, oneness in purity of love is one of the most beautiful things that human beings are capable of, it seems to me, from just the little taste of it that I described there. And so to think of God as just a rewarder or punisher, which would be worse, is a mistake. You're dealing with love itself. And the unity that produces extends to identifying with another person's sorrow, grief, sufferings, or even what is most disagreeable about them. And this is what God loves in us. Not so much our success, but our need and our weakness. And it's into this space that the divine compassion pours only under one condition: our consent. But it's a consent to this kind of love that is relentlessly searching, not for its own benefit, but to uncover in us, in the deepest recesses of our hearts, every trace of selfishness or self-centeredness that opposes the purity of the divine compassion and transmission. So to turn for a moment here to our spiral diagram, which is a kind of artificial way of trying to make comprehensible something that is beyond articulation, as far as I can see. The relationship with God is like falling in love in some degree. It can be very strong indeed, but it's temporary, and it usually accompanies our conversion in some degree, whether that conversion is to commitment to God or to the transformative process. And so as that, when we have cleaned up the top of the tell, of the obvious things that are obstacles to God's love in us, then we enjoy a certain freedom and peace from having gotten rid of the obvious things that are making us miserable. And then when God sees that we're pretty established in this relationship, he tends to back off and disappear. And this is called the night of sense, or in religious circles, the fervor of novices that is finally beginning to drain away. And it leaves people with the difficulties of confronting their weaknesses. The newness of meditation, especially if it's consoling, tends to make us think that all our troubles are over, or that we're making great progress in virtue, or that we can handle almost any difficulty. It varies, of course, with people. Some people start out with meditation that's very difficult from the word go. So you have a certain variety of responses depending on temperament and genetic gifts and whatnot. But this aspect of the journey is the transition from a consoling experience or a certain breakthrough in our relationship with God that goes away. And it's like saying goodbye to someone you greatly love. So that the ritual aspects or the various religious objects or routines or rituals that nourished us and that made us excited, and the liturgical music or incense or what all those things are that turned us on in the beginning are no good anymore. So one feels that one's developing relationship has been lost, and hence one feels, what did I do that was wrong, or what didn't I do that I should have done to preserve this? So these are our ego judging our spiritual experience from the principles of the rational self. That is not appropriate for the journey. What has happened is that we grew up or accomplished this stage of our journey, and it was time to move on. And because we didn't want to move on, God moved on first. So he moved downstairs and is waiting for us. So it takes a little while to catch up with this rhythm. So when we finally consent to the transition period, like an elevator, it's kind of a narrow place, and there's not much to see as a rule, most elevators. So this is the period that represents the transition. A dark night in which we don't find any satisfaction in the spiritual practices as before. And then when that is consented to, a new insight comes, a new sense of spiritual growth, and the capacity to bring that insight into the different aspects of our life, such as our relationship with God, with others, ourselves, and so on. And then you have a plateau for a little while until God thinks that we've accomplished what needs to be done there. Let's continue this journey. Remember, God is always moving. He's always happening. So another dark period occurs, or an unloading process, and you go through that narrowness for a while and deprivation, and then the sun comes out again, and the stars are shining, and the windows are bright and open, and there's a long period perhaps in which one adjusts, and so on until you come to the bottom of the pile. So that the dark nights that St. John of the Cross describes are probably special treatments, and are better thought of as part of the context of a whole movement of purification. And so this spiral then moves towards the purity of heart that is perfect humility, the willingness to be whoever we are and to trust God without bounds to take care of it. And then to respond, remember this upper spiral is also growing in the other direction according to the dynamics of spiritual development. Just to conclude today with one or two examples of what the fruits of the Spirit are. They're the activation of our deep core of goodness, or of the supernatural organism, which is a theological term, of course, or of the dynamic of faith, hope, and love. What the gifts the Spirit do is to bring those supernatural powers to further growth, so that whatever level of faith we may have now, this is not the end of the journey. But through the gifts, this capacity continues to grow. And as it grows, it moves towards the dispositions of the one, and to the resolution of opposites, and to the liberation of from the false self. So it's the positive side, I guess you'd say, of the divine therapy. One of these fruits is goodness. And goodness here means the capacity of our faith to see God in other things besides spiritual symbols. In other words, it sees God in nature. I'm sure that it perceives God in relationships, in spiritual friendships, in conjugal love, perhaps in art in some degree, or in science. These are all paths that God draws people to, as well as the religious paths. But the spontaneity of the gifts is that it tells you somehow, without you seeing anything, it communicates to you or transmits to you the presence of God in an event, in a little situation, in very trivial matters, even in a joke. In other words, God, who is hiding behind secondary causes because we can't face the intensity of his love head on in this world, sort of peeks through the cracks of our sense life, and it enables you to perceive this divine presence literally in everything that happens. Usually it's just in a few things to begin with. But the conviction grows in such a way that God is a hard time hiding himself completely anymore. It also has the opposite direction. It sees all things in God, so that instead of seeing objects only, it perceives them in relation to the divine presence in one or other way. Like in the example I gave you of Selma and I was perceiving in her sorrow something that I had never understood of God. So she was transmitting to me in her weakness and pain something about God I had never known before. So human relationships, if one is especially sensible, are probably the most fertile place in which God's tenderness and compassion and considerateness and patience in waiting and in choosing just the right circumstances and in coming to our help in details that are trivial to most people but which mean a lot to us. So that there's nothing that is insignificant or trivial in a God who is present in the particles of quantum physics. And especially when these are involved in the human condition, with its weakness, with its transitional phase that we're in, with the impossibility of it to experience complete liberation in this world, and yet to be able to find peace and happiness in a longing that is unfulfilled, in a body that is experiencing intense weakness and perhaps pain and suffering, and to find contentment there. This is an incredible manifestation of God, or as we might put it in Christian terms, of the risen Christ within us, and the activity of the Spirit that flows from that eternal love in God within us. So it becomes easier to see that we're really not doing anything for God, that God is doing everything for us, and that the greatest gift we can give God is to let God love us. That love is so intense and so trusting and so excruciatingly exquisite that you don't know what to do with this, because it's, how do you respond to infinite love? And this is the wisdom and the experience of growing oneness with the God who is beyond love while being love at the same time. So all that we see of the tragedy of this world needs to be seen in the context or background of an infinite love that is looking at the eternal destiny of the human race, and is not put off by any amount of horrors, but who is asking us to diminish these consequences of this transitional period of the human family, in which selfishness predominates, but which we can contribute to its change by accepting what happens and turning ourselves over to God's will, and in finding a certain contentment in the weaknesses and faults that we can't overcome. In other words, to be just who we are and to give that to God. This is the best contribution that we can make. And if God wants us to do something, then He will give us the strength to do so.